Hello and welcome to our Black History Month edition of Scholars Hub at Home. I am Isa Abdi-Jama, Alumni Engagement Officer at York. Thank you for joining us for today's session, Truth Commissions and State Building. Before we get started, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the land I am on. Because we may not be gathered in the same place, the land I am about to acknowledge might not be for the territory you're on. Please take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you're on. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It's now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon, One Boom Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Now, we would like to conduct a quick poll before this session begins. The question is, how will you rate your knowledge regarding the topic of today's presentation? The poll should pop up on your screen right now. I'll give everyone a moment to respond. Thank you, as it is helpful for our speakers to know more about our audience. If you need help with Zoom webinar, please feel free to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and enter your questions. Our team is ready to help you. That same function may be used to submit questions for our guest speaker to answer during the Q&A period. Please note that all your questions and comments are visible to our panelists and staff working behind the scenes. We ask that you keep your comments relevant and respectful. Dr. Bawa. Dr. Bawa is an associate professor at the Department of Sociology in the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies. Professor Bawa is the first African Black tenure-track professor in sociology in the history of the department at York, as well as the first African director of York's Resource Center for Public Sociology. Welcome, Dr. Sylvia Bawa.
Thank you very much, Isa, and thank you to everyone for being here and for inviting me to this afternoon's conversations.
Absolutely. Pleasure to have you. Please share your screen. I'll be back after your presentation for the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, I hope you can all see my screen. I am excited to be spending your lunch hour with you today, and I'm hoping that we can all have a conversation about issues to do with truth commissions and state building, which is the topic for discussion today. Clearly, this is a book that we've written about this particular topic with about 16 chapters in the book that we draw from practitioners, academics, and other people who work on truth commissions across various countries on the continent. And so in this particular discussions, and I have just 20 minutes to do the discussions, I am going to touch briefly on some of the main things that we discussed in the book, but in general, some of the conversations around truth commissions and state building, not just in Africa, but hopefully around the world. And I'm hoping that in the Q&A and in the era where we can have conversations after the presentations, that many of you will share some of your own maybe experiences, work, and again, questions about the work. We dedicated this book, and we do dedicate the book to all survivors who, at the risk of re-traumatization, bear witness to atrocities. I also acknowledge that this is a very heavy topic, and there are people who may not be able to bear a lot of not the discussions that are in here today, but a lot of the work of truth commissions can tend to be very heavy. And I want to acknowledge people in the room who may be feeling all kinds of emotions, or for whom emotions may be brought up by this particular topic. I completely understand that. Now, there have been over 50 truth commissions worldwide as of 2023. 50. The growth and popularity of truth commissions, especially following a period of prolonged conflict, atrocities, and as we've seen more recently in the case of Canada, residential school systems and attempted genocides and whatnot. In the case of South Africa, apartheid, and in so many other instances, they've become popular as a means of redressing issues to do with hurt, the atrocities that were witnessed or that were witnessed during that particular period, but importantly, as a mechanism for moving forward after that particular horrific period is concluded, as it were. Of course, it's also a means of recognizing the ongoing legacies of that particular period in the history of the people. Most of these truth commissions have been established in Latin America and Africa. More recently, of course, in the case of Canada, but we are seeing more and more of them pop up around the world. And truth commissions can be state-sponsored or state-centered things, or led by civil society organizations in different parts of the world. So they don't always look the same. It depends on the particular mandate. It depends on the reasons for which they are set up and all of that. And as I indicated earlier, the book has contributions from scholars, practitioners, as well as policymakers. Now, truth commissions as mechanisms of state building are very important things, in part because they seek to get the nation together to speak about the atrocities of the past. So there is an inherent idea that a recognition for truth-telling is important to moving nations forward or to sustaining any sense of cohesiveness in the nation. So there's also this idea of a collective healing, as well as hopes for reparation following a period of oppression and marginalization and other atrocities. Reconciliation is then expected to help to forge this kind of national unity, because the idea is that in setting up a truth commission, in understanding the truth of the past, that people will be able to heal, people will be able to forgive, or at least have the truth in hand to allow them to move forward. It also, in some cases, truth commissions can also serve as legitimation for certain political regimes. And if a political party platform should advertise that they would be interested in such a thing and they set it up afterwards, it can serve to legitimize a particular political party or a particular government. And so, as you can also imagine, these truth commissions in the various places that they are set up do not always have, there isn't always a consensus as to whether or not they are necessary, as to whether or not people want them. And as a matter of fact, they tend to be contested. They are contradictory in some cases, and most certainly imperfect in terms of the fact that sometimes there are very high expectations of what they should address or what they could address. And in some cases, they fall short of that, in part because the mandate do not actually allow for, sort of an expanded coverage in terms of the kinds of things that they deal with in the nation. So, and as you can imagine, you have different interest groups within any particular nation and people expecting all kinds of things, from these kinds of commissions. So the contestations that come about from truth commissions are natural and expected, I should say. But it's also important for us to then notice that because of these contradictory nature, there are many criticisms that are leveled against truth commissions and the work that they do in states. There are people who've actually argued that, in fact, that they do very little in terms of moving the nation forward, that by emphasizing past atrocities, that they tend to reignite ill feelings, they tend to reignite divisions, they tend to reignite trauma, and in a manner that is not always conducive for moving any particular nation forward. So there's also, of course, in terms of limitations, we have weak enforcement mechanisms. The emphasis of a lot of these commissions being on appeasement and not on justice, depending on what you want to define justice as. But there's a general consensus that the emphasis is on appeasing victims and to some extent then granting amnesty to perpetrators of those atrocities. And the emphasis on reparations, even if it is stated, there's not very much anyone can do to actually ensure that reparations are given. And so those limitations also extend to the fact that these truth commissions can be established on the whims, as it were, of a particular political regime, right? So it's not taken for granted that these kinds of truth commissions can be established. And therefore, the idea is that depending on which particular, the goodwill of a particular political party or government, you can have truth commissions or not. Now, in the case of Africa, and that is where a lot of the emphasis in the particular in the book lies, is that we looked at various truth commissions. In some cases, they have different names. Some of them are Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. Some of them are Truth, Reconciliations, and Reparations Commissions. Some of them are Truth Commissions. There are different names that are given to these commissions across board. And so in the case of the African countries that we studied, truth commissions are said to mirror indigenous models of restorative justice. And therefore, they tend to work well in that process of restoring the upset natural cosmological balance, which is why people also emphasize the importance of truth commissions following a period of atrocity. The image there is that of Bishop Desmond Tutu, who chaired South Africa's Truth and Reconciliations Commission, which is one of the more popular truth and reconciliation commissions in the world. But as you can also imagine, in the case of Canada, the emphasis was also not just on truth or telling the truth or unearthing the truth, but on reconciliation, right? And so the name there was also Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which in fact was modeled after the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. For many of you who may be familiar with the histories of both Canada and South Africa, there's some interesting borrowing in terms of the apartheid system in regards to the treatment of indigenous populations in both of those places, with the apartheid system in South Africa relying on or borrowing from the structure of the manner in which indigenous populations were treated in in Canada, in terms of being settled on reserves. But it's important to also note that in this particular case, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada was created by the settlement of something else, right? So this is something that was brought into being as part of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. And as a result, the country became very familiar with the kinds of atrocities that had been committed or that were committed during the period of the residential school system in Canada. Now, truth commissions tend to, in the case of Africa specifically, tend to emphasize issues of decolonization, Sankofa, and Ubuntu. Now, Sankofa is an Akan term that refers to reclamation, looking back and reclaiming that which is great, which is good, reflecting on the past and moving forward by picking up pieces of the past that are important and transformative for the future. Ubuntu is a popular Africanist philosophy, political, you'd say social philosophy that guides human action in terms of the fact that it emphasizes our interconnectedness as a human group, in terms of the fact that we depend on others for our needs and vice versa. In other words, related to Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, and in the case of South Africa, where this notion of Ubuntu was popularized, is the idea that the dehumanization of any one particular group of people also then dehumanizes even the perpetrator. In other words, we are all not served by oppression and or by acts of atrocity against any particular human being. So one of the things that, in my contribution to the book that I looked at was to look at the way in which decolonization could expand, or ideas of decolonization could expand our spaces for progressive conversations about historically rooted injustices, right? So who and what is mobilized in what ways when we use these terms, when we talk about the fact that truth commissions or truth and reconciliation commissions are essentially about restoration, that they are about decolonization, that they are about restoring a certain lost natural cosmological balance. And what is also obscured in calling into being some of these kinds of terms. So when we have visions of returns, ideas of reclamation, harmony, and collective progress, healing, and whatnot, what do those things do in terms of civic engagement and civic political participation in our nation and in our nation building? Now, in the Truth Commission report, in some of the Truth Commission reports that we looked at, and for the sake of time, I'm just going to talk about a few of these. There is that longing for reclaiming our humanity, or the humanity of the people of that particular nation. So, for instance, in the Sierra Leone's Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report, and I'm quoting, it talks about, quote, after years of brutal conflict in Sierra Leone, there existed a need to confront the past. Why did so many abandon traditions of community and peaceful coexistence? Why were long-held and cherished customs and taboos so wantonly discarded? What needs to change, and how will we affect the change? Similarly, unquote, similarly, in the Nigerian Commission report, there is this very important line: where did we make the wrong turn, right? Who was responsible for what opportunities did we miss, and why? What do we now need to do to put the past behind us and to look to the future with renewed hope and patriotic zeal? What are the basic conditions for us to effect national catharsis? Unquote. So you notice that in terms of talking about truth, there's a particular vision that is brought up, or in establishing these commissions, there's the idea that these commissions will get to the root of why certain atrocities took place in the manner in which they took place. So the idea that, they also beckon us to think about our collective humanity, and that the kinds of things that we are investigating through these truth commissions does not speak of the humanity that we know of, right? It's also very important and very powerful. And so in the South African, and this is an image of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you had this banner in the background of behind the commissioners that always said, "Truth, the road to reconciliation." And it was also, if you looked at the manner in which the commission conducted its work, it could send subpoenas to people who could refuse to attend those, to attend hearings. And so in a manner of speaking, it was also voluntary. People come to these commissions on a voluntary basis to give testimony, or to be cross-examined, to be asked questions, and all that. Now, in terms of truth commissions on their own, the process of looking at the work, there's a lot of emotion that is involved in the commission's work. Not just when you actually see the witnesses appear before commissions to tell their stories and whatnot, but in reading the report, in terms of the way in which people receive these kinds of reports, the way in which they witness the reports, even if they are watching from behind a television set and whatnot, there is a lot of collective emotion that is also brought to bear. And in my case, in researching this as a human rights scholar, and this is one of the things that we tried to do, was to blend human rights scholarship, post-colonial scholarship, as well as sort of conflict studies, to come up with not just the research questions, but the manner in which we conducted the research. So in reading a lot of these reports, I would say that I was not as prepared, although I prepared myself mentally as much as I could, at least psychologically, knowing that this was a very heavy topic going into it. However, this was a very difficult research process for me. This was very difficult in a lot of ways, in reading the reports, in reading witness testimonies, and sometimes also vicariously living through traumas that I didn't expect that I would live through. In particular, I looked at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa because I was very interested in looking at gender in the process of the South Africa's Truth Commission's report. And I zeroed in, so my chapter in the book zeroes in on Winnie Mandela in the case of South Africa. So as you can imagine, I read a little bit more about, the torture that she had endured all throughout the period in which she was imprisoned on, different occasions and all of those things. At times, really, I had to put the work aside for several weeks on end, and then I'd have to return to it when I could muster the courage to do it. But similarly, this is the way in which these truth commissions, impact the national psyche of people. The Kenya's report actually brings this up when it talks about the fact that these reports are written literally with the blood, sweat, and tears and the stories of the victims, and they convey the passion, integrity, and dignity with which these witnesses related their experiences. And it's also important that, this Kenyan report talks about the fact that these reports do not convey the silences, the tears, and the emotions, as well as the traumatic experiences, horrid experiences that witnesses and other people experienced during the particular period under investigation. And so in truth commissions in general, or the work of truth commissions, there's a zeroing in to some extent on victims and survivors of atrocities and of past atrocities. But in general, the idea is that the whole nation under that period of time would have been oppressed through the dehumanization of others, right? That the whole nation, even if they were not direct witnesses, were in some ways witnesses to the atrocities that were occurring. So during the period of apartheid, all the people in South Africa would have been enveloped in this very dark period of apartheid. During the period of the residential school system in Canada, even though there weren't others who were in the residential school system, that the residential school system itself cast a gloom over the humanity of people in Canada. But then in a lot of the truth commissions, there's also this emphasis, which I find, on the victim and the offender. Right? It immediately, although on the one hand, there's the emphasis on the national scale, on state building, on looking at the national picture, but there's also a zeroing in on the victim and the offender. In other words, someone comes to give testimony or someone calls on another person to acknowledge their wrongs. And there's also an emphasis in some cases on individuals, or there's a disparate emphasis on individuals versus group and the state as a whole. And so in the case of Winnie Mandela, for instance, in the case of South Africa, Winnie Mandela, on the one hand, as a victim of apartheid and as a victim of torture, as a victim of various things under the apartheid regime, came to the commission actually as an offender, right? So that was something that was very interesting in and of itself for me. And if you looked at it, Winnie Mandela then also represented a whole group, the group of Black South Africans under apartheid who had been traumatized by the entire apartheid system. And yet she came to the commission again as someone who had been accused of certain offenses, right? And so in a lot of ways, some of these truth commissions can then collapse very simple binaries, and they are collapsing victim and offender, almost in an individual way that obscures larger structural issues that we should be looking at. And again, in the example of Winnie Mandela, we are also looking at another subpopulation, Black women, in the construction of the nation. So what does this all mean for civic engagement and civic participation? This is an image that of the very infamous, very traumatic Soweto school murders, where that comes to mind at the moment. That also galvanized a lot of, it didn't only galvanize South Africans, but these images went at the time as viral as they could, international attention to what was happening in South Africa. And Winnie Mandela gave this very important quote, which really stayed with me in terms of, the idea that truth commissions also emphasize reconciliation, forgiveness, and moving on. And in her case, about the fact that she was then asked to admit certain wrongs when she herself had been a victim. She talks about the fact that, and I'm quoting her, if you were picking up the bodies of children on June the 16th, I can't pretend that I was this angel that I forgave, right? And then she says this is something that's very interesting and something that I get into a little bit in my chapter, about what were the expectations of Winnie Mandela were when she appeared before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. People were expecting more than she gave, as it were, right? So she'd say things like, I am not sorry and I will never be sorry, right? Because these are things and images that stay with me. I'm going to end the discussions here. I only had 20 minutes, so I thought I'd pull up various things. Of course, this was me when I finally visited South Africa, and I went to the house of the Mandelas. And I took a picture, obviously, with Winnie Mandela. But it was, again, and at this point, I was already conducting this research on the case. So as you can imagine, there were so many emotions for me when I finally walked through their house, and in a lot of ways was, almost relevant some of the kinds of traumas that she had lived or that they had lived through that period. Thank you very much. I'll end it here and take questions.
Thank you so very much for your very timely and informative talk, Sylvia. We now have time for questions. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. I will begin with the first question. Sylvia, why are truth commissions popular, or sometimes even categorized as important, in contexts of others as well?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the question. There are so many ways in which we can look at why they've become popular. I think part of it is because in some ways, people really do want to find a way out, a way forward after atrocities have been committed in a particular state. So following that period, that very hot period, people really want to look at the ways in which a nation could move forward. And there is a saying that the dead cannot rest if they are not properly buried. In other words, if the truth doesn't come out, a lot of people cannot actually have closure. And there are people who want to know what happened, right? That there's that not just the natural curiosity, but that it is inbuilt as a part of justice, as a part of the way we think about accountability. So it serves as a form of holding perpetrators and holding the state and holding people accountable. And therefore, what it does do is that it can ensure the sort of never again promise that we keep making ourselves, that people know and remember that no matter what happens, no matter how long it takes, that the truth will come out. And that once the truth comes out, of course, people are put to shame, you get apologies from the state and the rest of it. But what is important is that for people to understand their past is also to know the truth. And so there's been a lot of attention that is paid to truth commissions and transitional justice mechanisms. But there hasn't been as much attention paid to these commissions as ways in which they help with civic participatory processes, civic engagement, public participations are then very important as outcomes of these kinds of commissions. I haven't looked at the literature closely enough to see, but I can tell just from teaching at York University that following the period of the National Truth and Reconciliation Commission that Canada had, that my students seem to know a little bit more about the atrocities of the past of Canada, that they seem to be a bit more engaged than a few more years ago. And I'm talking first, second year students. And so truth commissions do serve that very important purpose in terms of rebuilding in these kinds of societies. So in the book, we looked at the kinds of mandates truth commissions have, the methods, as well as the outcomes in terms of how they end up serving these kinds of mandates. But for me, I think that truth commissions do a very important job of allowing a broader space for civic imagination, of civic reimagination of a nation that is a little bit more involved, more inclusive, where many more people are interested in participating, either in order to hold the state accountable and or to help build the state in a manner that reflects their collective interests.
Oh, thank you, Sylvia. We do have a question in the chat. What is the long-term benefits of a person telling their story of human suffering? Does it mean the harm endured is rectified?
That's a big question, and it's one that is very difficult to answer. And in all of the reports that we've looked at, and in the work that we've done, different people come to this from different angles. For some people, just telling the truth and having people witness it is enough.
Mhm.
And so, of course, there's a huge personal cost of doing something like this because you are reliving the trauma. And this is one of the reasons we dedicated the book to survivors, to people who actually bear witness to this. So there is that huge personal cost in that it opens up something that you may in some ways have moved on from. But for some of the people on the individual level, it provides a level of closure that is important for them, that they have acknowledgement and a recognition that that which was done to them was wrong. And that, it doesn't matter if it took 20 years, if it took 30 years or not, that this is important. In some cases, recommendations in some of the truth commissions have actually led to bodies being exhumed from mass graves and then reburied properly, transferred to families so the families could actually give those victims dignified burials. So there is something that is healing in and of itself from it. But in terms of whether or not the reparations that come with it or the benefits that come with it for individuals, that's hard for me to tell. I think that overwhelmingly victims, witnesses talk about the fact that it is cathartic for them to talk about their experiences, to share the experiences of family members, and in some cases to tell the stories of family members who may have passed on, right? That is very important for them as a result of some of those things. So that witnessing that then happens in a public forum serves a very important purpose for them. But the rest of it, it's still debatable.
Absolutely. Okay. There's more questions coming up in the chat. I just want to follow up with something that you just mentioned about the victims feeling cathartic in terms of emotional being. And you also described a quote from the Clinics Commission label, Kenya's report, which
Yeah.
described an emotional commission rather than an actionable one. In your view, how can truth commissions balance emotional catharsis with tangible policy outcomes?
That's a big question, and one that I kind of wish you hadn't asked me. In this particular case, no, but one that I'm also happy to talk about because in the book, which has 16 chapters, there are various recommendations, and I can't go through all of them. It's one of the things that I was thinking about in terms of, what exactly do I talk about? But there is, as I indicated earlier, there is in a lot of the truth commissions, from what we've seen, there's a greater emphasis on amnesty compared to, in some cases, actual reparations. So if you take the case of South Africa, for instance, the emphasis on reconciliation, on forgiveness, and something that Bishop Tutu really emphasized in the work did not in the end lead to reparations for the Black majority South Africans, whom for the most part are still very economically impoverished and marginalized, right? And so the structures that were enacted or strengthened during the period of apartheid still continue to oppress the large majority of Black South Africans. So on the one hand, in a way, one could say that the world got to get a little bit more involved in the truth telling. But as I indicated in the South African case, there was not as much emphasis, for me anyway, on holding the state accountable as much as it was more interested in holding particular individuals accountable for their role. Of course, that's also important. But then for me, what ended up happening was that you had this sort of narrow focus on individuals, and so not as much focus on issues of reparations, economic justice, and the rest of it. And also what is important here is that, in South Africa, and Desmond Tutu actually also mentioned this, that while the commission, had the amnesty mandate, in other words, people could be pardoned and the rest of it, it could not, on the other hand, emphasize or mandate in the same way reparations. Right. So on that score, you have, again, the dependence on political will to move forward with actionable items on the Truth Commission. So similar in the case of Canada, you have, the actionable, the calls to action, which, all of us are then asked to take up. But I think what is then important in this case is that when the larger majority of the population is aware and can use those things as means of holding their leaders accountable, their politicians accountable, because this is now an instrument that we can say, hey, listen, these things came up. We have calls for action. What are you doing? What am I doing as an individual? What are we doing as an institution to ensure that these kinds of things can be met?
Absolutely. Thank you, Sylvia. We do have about 3 questions in the channel. We have about less than 10 minutes for the Q&A period. I will first go with the first question. Has there been discussion around how this might be useful in the context of Gaza and rebuilding healing there? And what kinds of stability needs to be present first, or what kind of time passed before this can happen?
That's a very big question, and a tough one at that. I would, in this case, refer a lot of you to the work of Bonnie Bawa, who is at McMaster and who is a historian and who does a lot of work actually on truth commissions in general and looks at other nations beyond the work that was presented in this particular book. I think that the model works in a lot of cases. As I have said, in the different countries, it is different countries have different emphasis. And so in some cases, it is through truth commissions. In some cases, it is truth reconciliation commissions. So there's a name, or the name actually always indicates the mandate that the commission has. It can be fact-finding and whatnot. In the case of Gaza at the moment, it's still a very active case. Here we were looking at post-conflict societies. And from all indications, you can have a record or documentation of human rights abuses as they are happening. But I think it is quite impossible for you to hold a Truth and Reconciliation Commission or a truth-telling commission in very active conflict situations. So generally, there is the advice that you wait for a period of time, there's a bit of stability, as it were, and then that kind of commission can then be able to reflect or look at things. But while while the war, a genocide is happening, it's impossible, I think, for you to try to hold something like this together while people are still fighting for their lives. So there's that thing, and we're always looking at the post-conflict society, or at least this book looked specifically at post-conflict. Of course, that model is also being recommended for the USA in the wake of enslavement of African people, that it would be important for the USA to hold something like this, but not just of African people, but also for the USA to recognize its own atrocities for indigenous people in the USA, right? So
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Sylvia. Next question in the chat says, should there not be reparations in all cases? Merely seeking truth is not enough.
I completely
Probably,
agree.
yeah.
I completely agree. And a lot of witnesses, a lot of people all across talk about the same thing. The idea is that reparations are important to compensate or as the other side of the coin. So merely saying, we are okay with this, we've heard the truth, we've forgiven, and that we are ready to move on is not enough, because if you look at the structural issues that are at play here, without doing anything, and reparations on their own do not just mean sort of economic reparations at the moment, but they also mean and this is where the emphasis on state building comes into play. They also mean looking at the structures of the society that continue to marginalize, that continue to oppress people, and dealing with those kinds of fundamental injustices. Because if we don't deal with those kinds of issues, these things, the never again promise on its own cannot stand, right? Because it is those kinds of fundamental issues of injustice that keep cropping up. So looking at the social structure, what is the structure of our society? What is the structure of our nation? And this is one of the reasons why we're talking about civic engagement and looking at the ways in which truth commissions help with state, in some cases, rebuilding, looking at the state on its own, and looking at the kinds of things that enable various forms of oppression, so that the state in dealing with reparations for specific victims can deal with that. And I completely agree that reparations are very important, but that those reparations don't just end there, that they go into the infrastructure of the state and making sure that people can have access to talking about and demanding justice, and sort of a continuous renewal of state apparatus.
Oh, thank you. Next question in the chat states, how is the T in TC actually determined? Determining if T means the truth in truth commissions actually determined. And they have a follow-up with that. Could we have a truth commission mechanism beyond individual countries?
That's the truth. As I'll start with the truth. How is the truth determined? That's another big one. Right? There is some debate about whether or not truth commissions can actually get to the truth of any one particular matter. However, I think it was Michael Ignatieff who, may be known to Canadians. He was a one-time liberal leader of Canada, but also a political philosopher, by the way, who talked about the fact that truth commissions, that one of the things that truth commissions can help do is to reduce the number of lies, right, that go undetected. So in determining what is truth, there's the idea that truth on its own is not just known to the one person, because in the case of witnesses who come forward with testimonies, and this is why you call them witness testimonies, they tell the truth as much as they can see. And this is also why it is important for us to also look at the histories behind some of these kinds of atrocities. What was it that would have led to particular individuals being targeted, particular groups being targeted? So what is the truth in that, right? So then there are multiple versions, multiple levels of the truth. And so the truth telling in itself, it's not one that is meant to produce, as it were, absolute truths, as much as it is meant to be conversation starters of what happened. To some extent, there's fact finding, and maybe we can call that truth. And then there is the truth of the experience of things, right? There is a fact of what happened. There is a truth of how one or a group experienced that particular truth. And there is a truth of the history behind all of it. So the truth commissions and the truth being determined in that case, and of course, I haven't actually seen where anyone in the in the witness testimonies or even in the reports, try to define what truth is. So, but then others have also argued that we need to move beyond simply trying to say, find this truth. So, for instance, Baba Jallo, reflecting on the case in the Gambian Truth, Reconciliation, and Reparations Commission, and I think this is chapter 13 of the book, actually makes a very important argument that we must learn to think beyond the conventional notions of what a truth commission should look like and what its specific role should be. A truth commission in the African context must be thought of as both a quasi-judicial transitional justice mechanism and an institution for civic education and popular empowerment. And I'm quoting from Jallo. It's a very, it's one of those important quotes about, what is the truth? And that's a very important question. I think there was a follow-up to that question as well, Isa.
I think that was, let me read. Yes, so the follow-up was, how can we have truth commission mechanisms beyond individual countries?
Yes, that's not something that I think the UN has, various ways in which, yes, so perhaps there could be something like that that actually deals with the complicity of other nations in the atrocities that are committed at a certain period of time. If we think about it, especially, and that's also one of the limitations, and that's one of the arguments against truth commissions, is that they also tend to only be within the domestic realm of a nation, even though we know that in the cases of human rights abuses, massive human rights abuses, some of those abuses are, I don't want to say endorsed, but they can be facilitated by other nations outside of the, of that particular jurisdiction. You can look at the ways in which various countries would have been complicit during the period of apartheid. Various nations or other interest groups would have been complicit during the period of ongoing genocide, also in the Sudan, about war and atrocities happening in the DRC at the moment, various companies, countries, transnational corporations that are all complicit in that process. So I think that that's an important thing to think about. I haven't actually come across that model, but there may be others who've looked at that kind of model. There are various ways in the UN in which this happens, but then it is less of the sort of national Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. I should also then add that there are civil society-led Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. And those ones, can tend to involve, using the human rights methodology of naming and shaming other entities or other actors outside of the state that would have been complicit in atrocities in the particular state.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your very informative talk and presentation today. That concludes our Q&A session. Dr. Bawa, thank you so very much again for being with us today. You're now welcome to turn off your video and if you have a few final remarks.
Well, so thank you so much again for this very important forum. I have to say that even though the period of writing this book and my chapter is over, every time I come to talk about it, I'm always as less composed as I normally am when I am doing or speaking about my other work. And it is because it always evokes all kinds of emotions, because I remember the things that were in the report, the kinds of atrocities that various people have suffered all across the world. So, of course, the only thing that I can say is that when we do make that never again promise, that we remember that there are people whose lives were cut short, whose dreams were lost as a result of various atrocities, and that as people who within this Ubuntu circle, where we know that the oppression of others only diminishes us as human beings, that we all work really hard to ensure that there are no atrocities in our world, that we can hold our political regimes accountable, especially in their complicity to genocide, to atrocities, to wars, sometimes that are occurring outside of our own nation states, because those are the places that can be very well hidden in terms of the kinds of atrocities. But that we just remember that people suffer enormously, and that the suffering doesn't end even when the people die. There are the repercussions, the generational traumas that carry on years, decades after the process is ended. So, of course, I'm going to end on that note by saying that we all have to be accountable to ourselves as human beings, to our nations, but more importantly, that we do have to watch out for the humanity of others in our lives on a daily and a regular basis. And I'm grateful for the conversations. As I said, talking about this book always brings me a lot of emotion, but I am grateful, honestly grateful, to have learned so much about the world from doing the research on it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Sylvie. Thank you. All right. A recording of the video will be posted on your YouTube channel. Please see the link in the chat. Thank you, Sylvia. We have one more poll question for the audience. How will you rate your knowledge for today's topic following this discussion? It should pop up on your screen right now. Scholars Hub will be back on Wednesday, March 5th for a very timely edition for the with Daniel Drake, Professor Emeritus and Senior Scholar, Department of Politics Research Fellow, Roberts Center for Canadian Studies, Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies. Professor Drake will present Trump and the Troubled Future of Canada. On March 26th, we are excited to invite you to our special in-person edition of Scholars Hub at the Markham Public Library, featuring Farshid Shams, Associate Professor of Strategy and Organization Studies from the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies. Professor Shams will be exploring the challenges faced by social workers when caring under constraints. If you are looking for other engaging discussions, make sure to check out our York Circle event series, where you will hear from York's leading faculty members on a wide range of interesting topics. Our next session will take place on March 22nd. Stay tuned for more information. To register for these events and learn more about upcoming sessions, please visit yorku.ca/alumni and friends. Thank you, and be well to all. Have a nice afternoon.